Good evening. We are excited to be here once again with our amazing panel, Future Kane and Aaron Heffernan. I am really excited to come again to you from the Bridge Broadcast Show. My name is Tina White, and the goal of this evening is to have a conversation. We started the conversation yesterday on COVID-19 and the racialized trauma. We really were taking a look at the effects of how this affects students. We really went down the road of how it affects us as professionals, and having the conversation and looking at how this has affected us. We know that there's been an effect on students, and our conversations were so wide yesterday that we talked about from the topics of microaggressions. We talked about achievement gap, trauma-informed students. We talked about socioeconomics. And tonight, we want to do a little recap. I'll give you an opportunity for those of you who didn't have the opportunity to meet our panelists this evening on the Bridge Broadcast Show, where we focus on getting you from where you are to where you want and need to be in life. And so I'd like our panelists to have the opportunity to introduce themselves again this evening. And we'll start off, ladies first, and we'll start off with Future Kane. You ready, Future? I want to hear from you. You're unmute.
Hi, thank you so much for joining us again in this two-part series. So I always tell people I don't describe myself by titles. I think it's important for you to know who I am. And as a person, I'm a mom. I'm a mom of 2 elementary school children. My son is a kindergartner this coming year, and my daughter is going into 3rd grade. I, in addition to that, am also a person who practices what I am willing to teach and share with everybody, which is yoga and all the pillars of yoga. And with that as a background, my love has been in education for more than 20 years. And that love and passion has come primarily with students with disabilities. And I've served children that has had Asperger's, they were diagnosed with Asperger's, to bipolar, attention deficit, hyperactivity disorder, to a broad spectrum. And currently I sit as the director of social and emotional learning and community outreach for my school district. So that is me wrapped up quickly.
Awesome, Future King. Thank you and welcome this evening. Aaron, please say your full name. So I want to make sure I didn't say it wrong.
No, you got it. It's Aaron Heffernan. I'm with Jewish Family Services here in Milwaukee. We're a community-based mental health facility that works with all families, all ages. My specialty is with children. I'm a husband and a dad myself of 3 high schoolers who all started their virtual learning journey today. And could have gone worse, that's all I can say. And I'm reminded, a friend told me on Facebook, one of the greatest teachers of children also taught virtually, and that was Fred Rogers. He taught through a screen, just like all of my kids' teachers were doing today. So, that's something that we should all remember, is that we're rolling our eyes. Oh, our kids got to go back to online learning. Well, Fred Rogers was doing this on TV long before all this. Anyway, yeah, I work with kids. Came to Jewish Family Services through Children's Hospital, community services. Most of my career has been with traumatized children and child survivors of developmental and complex PTSD. Been lucky to work alongside Future Kane for a couple of years now in the Brown Deer School District. Our agency is embedded in a couple of schools where we provide therapy to kids and support for teachers. It's great to be back here. And I really look forward to continuing our conversation from yesterday.
Thank you so much, Aaron, and welcome again tonight to this conversation. And I trust that this will be a good resource for people who will listen after this. And tonight I'd like to start off something you both said. You mentioned a lot of, like Future, you mentioned you worked with an array of Asperger's, and you named the list. And Aaron, you mentioned mental health and traumatized children. I'd like to start off with a conversation around that and this, I don't want to say stereotypes or the the concern around those topics in Black families, mental health in Black families. What, in your experience, have you seen with mental health and disorders in Black families? Let's start with Future.
I would say the one thing that we know for fact is that we have an exorbitant amount of especially Black males who are diagnosed with a disorder. And then that disorder leads to IEP in the school system. And what I would probably caution anybody who is diagnosing, whether that's a teacher bringing it forth or other staff members or a parent, would be, is it trauma that is showing up in many different ways that you then think it is something that needs to be diagnosed as a learning disability or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, when maybe it in reality is post-traumatic stress disorder that the child is experiencing, but we just can't diagnose, or we didn't even think to go down that route. I also have seen a stigma of not wanting to discuss, okay, I have this. And we all know the United States, in comparison to any other country, is higher rates for anxiety and depression. That's facts. And we've been continuously that way for decades and decades and decades. And with that, I just want to caution people to say, sometimes you do need help from your community. And if that community help is speaking to Erin or somebody else who is a trained professional, then that's okay. But a lot of times we, one, don't have access to, or we don't want to acknowledge, because admitting that something is wrong is the first step in your journey to becoming a better you. I think those are the things that I would add, but Erin, you could weigh in a lot more than I can with your background.
I'm right there with you on this, Future. I think my field historically has done a huge disservice to Black people when they say, when the mental health field says that symptoms are somehow an illness, that we'll call ADHD or depression or bipolar, when it is really a response to overwhelming stress, or day-to-day stress, or microaggression. And to call it an illness is still to blame the person who's suffering and put the onus on them to change. The PTSD diagnosis didn't get put into my manual until veterans groups teamed up with domestic violence advocates to get that put in there. And it still doesn't exist a diagnosis for developmental trauma in children. Those children don't exist in my diagnostic manual. They're trying to make that change. There's been a lot of effort and randomized trials across the country to try to get developmental trauma disorder put in there as this larger, I think, ethical shift away from calling it an illness as opposed to a natural biological response to structural oppression and family and community stress. So I think this is where social work, my field of clinical social work, has a lot of work to do in repairing and correcting a lot of damage that the mental health world has done historically, to put the blame on Black people for being somehow ill. When the social work response, which is one that is fundamentally oriented towards addressing inequalities in society. So I'm right alongside you in this, Future, and have also seen. Well, it's interesting. I don't know why it is. Maybe because I'm a white person, but I actually haven't experienced as much of the stigma with the Black families that I've worked with in schools and in outpatient clinics. And I don't know why that is. Maybe because I'm an outsider or what. I've actually seen, this was whether working with foster families or other Black families, not a lot of resistance to coming to therapy. And I'm not sure why that is. Maybe it was the nature of the schools that I've been placed in that have done so much good work around destigmatization of mental health. and not calling it an illness, but a response to stress that will become worse and can become violent if it's not supported and given space. And I guess my last point is how lucky I have been, I feel, to have worked in community mental health and gotten to experience the tremendous resources and resiliency and beauty in the Black families I've gotten to work alongside, and have learned over the years about how it's, in many cases, the Black grandmothers that are holding the city together in many ways. And I've just benefited from that in a tremendous way. So long answer to your question, thank you.
No, you did a really great job. I mean, you brought up so many things. And, you know, today I want to unpack, we threw a lot of terms around yesterday. I want to start with, we don't want to assume that everybody knows what PTSD is. PTSD, what does that look like for the people you work with? What does that mean? What does it look like? What does it feel like? What does it sound like? So that people can start identifying post-traumatic stress syndrome. How do I know that's what it is? You know, sometimes people deal with things and they may not know that that's what it is. Like a future mention, you know, our Black boys, you know, they're being diagnosed, but it's their response to stress. Aaron, help us understand, what does that look, feel, and sound like?
So PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is a medical condition, and it's a label, and it doesn't describe a person. And it describes their symptoms that can be observed outwardly. Like I said, it came up in my mental health diagnosing manual after veterans groups and domestic violence advocates got together and said, look, when a person's exposed to extreme stress and overwhelm, human beings tend to exhibit a cluster of symptoms that look like flashbacks. It looks like avoidance behavior of certain triggering things. There seems to be a pattern of reliving the experience over and over, even when the initial stressor is gone. So it's been really helpful in the one sense in describing initially what Vietnam veterans were experiencing coming back to the US after combat, you know, being home with their families and not being in the jungle anymore, but still experiencing gunshots and reliving sensory experiences as if they were over in Vietnam. In one sense, that's good. Or say a survivor of domestic violence who's no longer in a dangerous situation and living in a safe place, but still experiencing avoidance behavior, flashbacks, depression, anxiety, hypervigilance, you know, hyper arousal. But in the other sense, it doesn't quite capture, well, what do you do if you live in a home where this is ongoing? What do you do if you live in a community where access to healthy food and jobs and resources and you know, clean alleys and is ongoing. So I want to say it's a helpful label, but it's just a label. In the same way that an ear infection is a good way of describing, you know, someone who's suffering from an ear infection. It doesn't describe the person; it describes symptoms. And we have yet in the medical and mental health community to come up with, I think, a proper and broad description of a way of describing the intergenerational impact of structural oppression, of trauma, of microaggression and actual aggression and health disparities. because it's not, you know, I think it's wrong and unethical to call it, to cast it as an illness. So I don't know. Preacher, do you want to add anything to that?
So here's what I'm going to add. The complication comes in right now because the symptoms that one experiences when they have post-traumatic stress disorder are problem sleeping, or maybe the person is depressed or grouchy, or feels a little bit nervous, or is having trouble being affectionate or aggressive, right? Or loses touch with reality. The problem is that those are also very common because we're in the middle of a pandemic. So of course your sleep is going to be disrupted because you have no idea. We're not in control of a lot of things right now. Or of course you may feel a little depressed because literally your social connections have been cut off dramatically because of us needing to be in our houses more, or the kids learning virtually. And of course you're going to feel nervous because everything is, I have no idea what's going on 5 weeks from today or tomorrow. So I think that's where it's going to be hard for parents, guardians, or loved ones to even say, what is my child experiencing?
So yeah, so I think it's a great point. I mean, I think it's helpful to be able to name things. You name it to tame it. Let's call it PTSD. But like Future says, we can't pathologize people for having natural biological responses to uncertainty. And now it's widespread uncertainty with COVID and America's reckoning with racialized trauma so sleeplessness and anxiety are natural biological responses to uncertainty. And the way through it is, in my opinion, human connection, however we can get it.
You know, that's really amazing, Aaron. You guys, you know, you said you pathologized it. And, you know, this, I couldn't figure out the word, but Future said it's stigma. We blame the illness, but there's a need for destigmatization of these titles. And, you know, you happen to be, Aaron, fortunate to be working with some people, you know, and maybe it's changed. I'm not specifically in that field, but, you know, there was a time that Black people just didn't name it. And you said something really powerful. It's the grandmothers, the grandparents that are, you know, holding the community together. And so, you know, the conversation keeps going back to, you said intergeneralization, generational impacts, structural oppressions, microaggressions, health disparities. It keeps coming. We cannot get away from this. And all those things, they compound onto traumatized children. So we talked a little bit about PTSD, but let's talk a little bit, what does traumatized children look, feel, and sound like? How do we identify that as professionals in classrooms where we identify what it is, identify it for what it is, without continuing to re-traumatize those students? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. The simplest description I have is biological. It's when a kid's nervous system is doing one of two things. And you think of the three bears. This is how I remember. It's either too hot or too cold. And you want to get a kid to just right. Too hot means they're hypervigilant, aggressive, acting out. Too cold is when they're shut down. These kids often get overlooked because they don't cause a lot of trouble in the classroom, but they could be tuned out. The fancy word is dissociating, but tuned out, numbed out, and not connected. And a kid who's either too hot or too cold can't learn. And I know the great work of Future and her colleagues at Brown Deer is to engage children socially. It's only in relaxed social engagement that a kid's gonna learn. So that's my easiest, I wish they said this in the mental health manuals. It's the three bears. They're too hot, the kid is too hot, or too cold. We want to get them to just right. And when they're in just right, they can learn.
Now, here's what I'm going to add though to that, Aaron. The problem with society is we put labels on everything, right? So even from a young age, we say, oh, well, my child or that child's shy. Now, when you're saying that child or my child is shy, is it your child's shy? Or it could be that your child's reaction to something traumatic that essentially has happened. And that's their way of coping. And then you go to the other spectrum. I just think how many times I've been called, well, you're hyperactive and you're really loud and you're this and you're that, right? Okay, that's fine. But then we also have to remember some people, that's just their personality. And that's why you hit the nail on the head of you really need to take time to understand these children, the adults you're working with, because what may be my normal, if I'm super active all the time, because that's how I am, if I'm coming in for weeks upon weeks, depressed and super just going about my business, then something's wrong. But every child, we have to remember their beautiful talents and their uniqueness, because what is just right for Goldilocks is very different for every single child at every single age in different settings too. At home, they may be one way, at school, they'd be another way. In athletics or activities, they could be a whole different way.
Great point.
Wow. And you know, I'm thinking about this. You talk about personality and, you know, dissociating, you know, you talk about patterns of reliving these things over and over. You know, when somebody relive a pattern over and over, those ways of being just slide in, either, you know, like knowing what your child is or your student is, you know, the too hot or the too cold. So talk to us from a parental perspective, first of all, and from a professional perspective. How do you know? Because there's no manual for kids. How do you know how to identify patterns of reliving a trauma and how that played out in their behavior as we relate this to too hot or too cold, reacting and coping, dissociating, etc. How do you bring that all together? Because the goal tonight is to let's identify this thing and not let you be 45, 50 years old and realize that you've been traumatized in life. How do we identify this? Erin.
I want Future to answer this, but I'm just going to set Future up here because I think I know how she would. I believe very much in the wisdom of the body and listening to the subtle promptings of your body. That's where traumatic memories get stored. That's where resilient memories are stored too, in a felt sense in your chest and neck and arm or whatever. And trauma has a way of getting us disconnected from our body. When we're traumatized or hit or violated in some way in our body, the body's not a safe place to be. So when we can go back into the body as a safe place, sometimes by doing things like yoga or exercise or whatever, parents can rely on their own breath, on their own body as a resource for how they can then help regulate their child in relationship. And we tell our kids, go over there and self-regulate by yourself. Kids don't self-regulate. They co-regulate with a relaxed adult who's sitting with them and singing to them or spoon feeding them or looking at them or just listening. So Future knows more about yoga than me. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but go ahead.
Okay, so I'm just going to throw my life out there and not too much details, but speaking from being in traumatic situations, right, before, and having to live through those, I know that some people who have experienced trauma, their immediate defense is to block it out, right? And it might be, I just completely shut down and I suppress the memories and I don't move myself through those actual memories, because the hurt was so painful to actually sit with. So the work of social emotional learning, I am urging people, and even recent with the civil unrest, that you have to get your own self-awareness first, okay? So you as a person, you have to, it's important, if you experience something, you have to sit with it, regardless of how painful that is. Now, if that's sitting with it with a counselor like Erin, or if that's sitting with it with yourself, but you have to sit with it and just think, how has this affected me? And then I would also say, like you said, Aaron, you have to name it. So if you know you put your child in a traumatic situation, then we have to address, we can't just sweep it underneath the rug, because a lot of times families, it's so horrific or painful. Maybe it wasn't them, but it was them not caring for the safety of their children possibly, or they couldn't at the time, where then their family or their children are put in a situation that was traumatic. So to just ignore it, it's only going to do more psychological damage to the child, that they will then, it will be compounding on top of each other for years and years and years and years. So I always tell people to, one, you have to be self-aware. You have to be self-aware of whatever it is, then to, like you said, Aaron, regulate yourself. So emotional regulation, because if that comes up, then how do I work through it? Because you might have a reoccurring nightmare. You might have a song or a scent or a smell or a person that you see that's going to be a trigger for you. So then you have to know as a person, how do I get myself to a calm, peaceful place, or the most calm, peaceful place I can be in regards to that situation again. And I would also add on top of that, then with all that, it's been proven that if you have at least one caring person who cares for you, and it doesn't have to be a parent, although a parent or guardian is nice, but if you have a mentor or somebody that you truly know loves you as a person unconditionally, then I think I would hinge on that person to walk you through and guide you through, or just be there as a support, whether that's crying, whether that's listening, whether that's just making you laugh and getting your hurt outside of yourself and not having to hyper focus on it. The other thing I would tell people is what you resist will persist. So that will never go away if you keep resisting it. And that's why I keep trying to plead with people of, please be self-aware, especially in regards to civil unrest. If you have no idea how your actions are showing up, or what thoughts you have about certain groups, or how you've treated people, or the stereotypes or the prejudices and the bias that you hold, you can't then have a conversation or even take action to move forward to be a better person. And that's the same with trauma. You have to name it to tame it in order not to resist, to persist, so that you could be your best self. So I would say yoga and breathing techniques are something to go to. Even meditations, if you want to put it out there to say, I'm going to be mindful and, meditate for a while, and I'm putting it out there of what has happened to me. Bring it to me when my body and when my mind is ready. Because what people forget is, think about every beautiful creation that we have, whether it's structures that were built 400 years ago, whether it's the Zoom conference call that we're on right now, whether it's the clothes that we have. All of those were created where first? In our mind. It was all created in our mind that then developed that stuff. So your mind is very powerful, and that's what people forget. You need to get more positive affirmations into your mind and let go of the judgments and the negativity, because you will live in a mind of prison if you allow it to be. And that's not what you want at all.
Okay, that was all a mouthful. I mean, we went from body to mind to trauma to, okay. I don't even know where to begin, because it's all so good and it's such good stuff. Wow. And this is the kind of knowledge that our community needs. This is not the conversation that we have, and it takes me, I'm going to defer it for a minute, but I want to go back. And Aaron, you had something that you wanted to say. We were talking about, you said name it to tame it. Oh my goodness. We were talking about who suffers the most as we can't get away from this structural oppression, the microaggressions, Aaron, you were saying something yesterday about the white male population, how you find it hard to sit with it. Do you remember what you were sharing, that we said we needed to get that out? And we'll come back to some of these other rich items that we talked about. I know you were probably going somewhere else, but
that's okay. I'm here.
You were saying, what is the highest population for suicide? Do you remember that conversation?
Yeah. We were talking about I don't know, maybe
We're talking
depressed white males or traumatized white males and legacy racism.
you know,
And we were, yeah, that's the highest suicide rates are still older white males still, and that's year after year after year. I think that was in context of our discussion how prejudice and racism hurts everybody, and how trauma loves isolation.
yes.
So when communities are isolated from each other, and I think this is true of the handful of white males that will possibly make their way into my office. Most I would say in this area come to therapy because they're ordered to. White men that come to therapy tend to be voluntarily, I think, more self-aware, wanting to do the work when it's not some externally motivated thing. But yeah, I think the high suicide rate in older white males says something about an illness, a generational illness in the white male population too. I can't speak as an authority on adult white males. I'll say that I am one, but I don't work with a lot of them. I work with kids. We were really lucky at JFS a couple of years ago at our speaker series. We did a series on men and depression, this wonderful group in Minneapolis, and I'm so sorry I'm forgetting their name. They came and did a full day presentation on men and depression, legacy of suicide, and was just really, really eye-opening and hopeful. If I could just share one fascinating way that they're reaching more and more white males for mental health support is they're putting suicide hotline numbers in the urinals at taverns, because most white males are not going to seek help on their own. They need cover and they need to hide, and so subtle ways to get the support out there. I don't know if I'm really addressing your question, but
we were talking about white fragility. We were talking about how fragile and how in control, but yet the conversation with the population we deal with keeps coming back to these structural oppressions, these microaggressions, this systemic racism, the perpetuation of how these communities of traumatized communities are impacted, and how the collision between these structural oppressions and the white male. And we were talking about the conversations like, how do we get this, how do we move this forward? And we'll come back to strategies. Well, how do we move this forward? And we were talking about, how, we were just talking about the white male future. You remember any of that conversation, which was really rich? We were saying, you got to share that, Aaron. You got to share that. It was 24 hours ago.
My memory serves me right. I think we were talking about how all of this civil unrest and racism is affecting white males too. And where we think that African Americans, people perceive African Americans sometimes as not resilient, but we've demonstrated how resilient we are. And I think Aaron then brought up how if you look at demographics and facts, that we aren't the people that choose to commit suicide, even with everything that we bear in any given day, any given week, any given month, any given year. He then said it was the white males who continuously, year after year, that's who commit suicide.
And I think it's a tricky conversation if we're doing it in terms of white fragility. And I think we're referring to Robin DiAngelo's book, who talks about, let's be careful not to make this all about white people's problems, because that takes the focus off of Black suffering, by having white people's suffering now dominate the conversation again. Mm-hmm. But yeah, maybe it was helpful for us to look at statistics and facts, and yeah, that gives us some clarity, and maybe we just sort of came to this point because in our conversation about COVID and racialized trauma, I believe it's the White Fragility book where she talks about racism as a virus that can mutate and change, and that we need to be vigilant about. And so we have this actual virus here that is changed and devastating our economy and in our relationships. And maybe it's helpful to think of racism in that way through history, how it's found a way to mutate, evolve, and find the shadows. So not to get us off topic there, but
because it's all a part of it, because I like how Future brought us back to resilience and how resilient, this group is. And, what is helped this group to be resilient? When you think about resilience and you think about the populations you work with, one was the grandmothers. What helps this population to be resilient? Is it spirituality? Is it, foundations in churches? Is it, what have you seen that has helped this group? Historically, we made it through slavery because of the church, because of the, our faith in God as a Black people, because that was the outlet. But we're looking at now, as we're dealing with everything we're dealing with, what is the key to helping this group of people be resilient? Who wants to tackle that one? What have you seen?
I can only speak as a white male of privilege. But one of my favorite authors, if I could quote another, Joy DeGruy, she's a professor from Vanderbilt who wrote a book, PTSS, Post-Traumatic Slavery Disorder, which describes the legacy of slavery and discrimination, and Jim Crow is the real reason why we see so-called mental illness in the Black population. And she put it really beautifully. She said, "I see Black people as a miracle." And so you name, I've been fortunate enough to be alongside and experience these resources of spirituality, of family, of art, of Black beauty and spirituality as an incredible renewable resource. So go ahead, Future.
I think the one thing I would say is community, in whatever that way it is. If it's in your church, if it's in your neighborhood, if it's in your home with living with grandma and auntie and all those, I think it's just community in whatever way serves them. There's a strong base of you're not alone. You have other people with you.
That's really true, community. And so, as we start bringing this to a close, I think we hit every hot topic that's coming up tonight. Now let's go back to like some of those resources that you begin to mention, Aaron, and you bounced it to Future. You said wisdom. The body has wisdom, and you said you tied that to resilience, but then you talked about self-regulating and then co-regulating. Tell me a little bit, let's talk about what does that look like? Self-regulating, co-regulating. How does that play out in families, and how does that play out in classrooms?
Okay, so what everybody has to remember is the science behind us, right? We could boil down to science and electrons pretty much, and we feed off of energy, whether anybody wants to say it's fact, but we feed off of other people's energy. So when you have a parent at home right now who's high stress and anxiety, if you think that your children are always going to be walking around as calm beings, not going to happen, because they hear you and they see you and they feel you. So they're going to be uptight too. So I think as a person, you have to show your children how you emotionally regulate, whether that's through breath or whether that's through, I need to get a walk into nature, or I have to go outside, I have to listen to music. Show your kids, because that is co-regulating, because you need to teach them before the episode actually happens. Nobody's going to say, Future, I'll go do a breathing technique with you when I'm in the middle of an anxiety attack. It doesn't happen like that. So right? So the more you front load and practice and are proactive instead of reactive, the better your brain then will form the habits and the pathways to immediately go there when something happens.
A great point. And this is what all skillful grandparents know. It's little micro regulations, little things along the way. We're not going to, it's the little gestures of predictability and stability that skillful parents and grandparents and aunties and uncles do, because there will be a day, especially with adolescents, where you have a tsunami in your living room all of a sudden, or toddler, whatever. It's what kids do, right? And something I've learned from working with people is sometimes it's neutral time that is planting seeds for, God forbid, when there is a crisis. So your neutral time, slow time alongside them, breathing the same air, is one way of protecting and nurturing that future possible crisis. So yeah, I don't think anybody, maybe this is radical, I don't think anybody really self-regulates. They go into a room by themselves and sort of does something. I think when we do stuff like meditative practices, which I don't do enough of, but when we do stuff alone to center and ground ourselves, I think we're actually warming up memories of when we were held and regulated by another, real or imagined. I think that a song or a smell or a food or some sensory thing that would soothe our nervous system as babies is maybe what we're doing when we're in a good yoga pose, or when we're in a deep meditative state, or doing music or whatever it is. And then, yeah, to Future's point, when the grown-up then brings that into the relational field with their little one, they're literally changing the kid's brain.
That is powerful. You know, really changing the kid's brain, really reprogramming. And you know, what you were just talking about, Aaron, where those triggers that Future was just talking about, you know, those memories, those it just reminds me of the movie, the kid movie, Inside Out, you know, the triggers, you know, how we associate things. And I'm going to bring it back to you, Future, you know, with yoga. Is yoga, I know mindfulness is a growing practice in school, but yoga and mindfulness, how does the two merge together in practice? You know, hopefully when people look at this, we want to have them to have some understanding and some insights on how do you make that make sense? We don't talk about like what we're talking about every day.
Okay, so here's what I'm going to say, because Western society a lot of time wants to say yoga, and then people assume yoga is the physical practice. Okay, so I need to just clarify that for everybody. The physical practice of yoga, which so many people are used to seeing and calling yoga, is technically a pillar, and that pillar is called asana. So there's 8 different pillars in yoga. Asana happens to be one of them. That's a physical practice. Now, when you're in a yoga pose and doing asana practice, whether it's warrior one, I'll say warrior one we're doing, okay, or child's pose, you're usually quiet. You're in a quiet space listening to no music or quiet music, calming music. So then you're being mindful, or you're doing meditation at that point, because you're calming your mind. It is the opposite. There's 2 different kinds of mindful, right? Our minds are so full sometimes with everything that's going on in life of, I'm thinking about the past and that person, how dare they cut me off when I was on the road and I wanted to turn, or, oh my God, I'm panicking about, I don't have a job. Where's my next meal coming from? And then so many of us are missing this present moment. That present moment that we just had just fleeted, literally. So it's gone. And it's you being in the present moment when you're practicing yoga, which then gives you you're being mindful in that moment. But then you also have to use your breathing techniques to keep yourself in that pose, keep yourself centered, balanced, and use your strength. So that's how all of the 3 of those pillars tie into one. And then obviously it calms your brain. It's a go-to. Breathing has been proven scientifically. If you take 5 deep inhales and exhales, 5 seconds in, hold it, 5 seconds out. It literally, do it one day. You will immediately go from, I am super angry, to, okay, I could find myself in a less angry place, because it's a rewiring quickly of your brain.
Wow, Aaron, Future talks about yoga, but you have this similar conversation of representations. Talk to us about representation, and I think those representation ties us back to repeating patterns. How can we begin to replace those representation, like I mentioned in the movie? How do we begin to breathing in yoga? She gave us some insight. What would you add to the conversation?
Before I do that, I just want to, Future reminded me in her discussion of yoga, there was an awesome study that was done, it's like in the 70s, on Vietnam vets at the VA, where they compared the effects of regular yoga practice to the effects of, I think it was Prozac or antidepressants, and yoga blew the psychotropic medication out of the water in the studies. It was a higher compliance with the yoga treatment than was with medication, and longer effects that generalized over time of the group that did yoga. There was they said one variable was that the yoga teachers were young and attractive young teachers at the VA, and the patients all wanted to come and see them. So anyway, yeah, so that just the passion and knowledge with which Future describes it just reminded me of this study, and tons of science behind it. How do we change the representation of toxic or traumatizing things in our life? Is that sort of what you're saying?
Yes.
Do the stuff that Future's telling us to do. Learn how to breathe, learn how to get in touch with your body. But we talk about resources, and maybe this is why our discussion has gotten more energized. Resources have been here. Group singing, cooking something for your neighbor, acts of small and incremental connection that are part of a balanced mental health diet, and have been around way longer than psychology. So, it's too bad we don't do group drumming anymore as a species as much. These are things that attune groups to each other. I was saying to a friend, I can say this, it's a shame that white men don't dance as much anymore in groups like they used to do square dancing and church dancing and stuff like that, where they would practice safe touch and safe proximity to other bodies. I think that was a good cultural way to release tension. So group activities that are synchronous. I would also say, this is a whole other discussion, but the power of play. There's some strange thing that happens, I think, in American culture when you reach the age of 18, you stop playing, or we think you're supposed to stop playing. And this is a deep biological need. The awesome series in National Geographic where you see this giant polar bear coming up to the sled dog, and you think there's going to be this confrontation. And what do the two mammals do? The two top predators of the Arctic, they start playing. It's rough and tumble play. This is the work of Stuart Brown, who talks about the importance of safe, rough and tumble play. That's why I love working with athletes. They understand boundaries really well, and physical boundaries. So we talk about resources. How do we change the internalized negative messages, negative images? It's through present-minded, I think, regulated and sometimes synchronous group activity. A yoga class, you're all doing these poses together. You're all sort of following the instructor in your own way that's safe. There's just so much rewiring inside the mind-body that happens in those activities. There's a reason why tons and tons of people still go to concerts together. I shouldn't be doing it now, but that's a reason why they go. It's because it's tribal. It's a deep communal activity. So we already know. We don't need any more research to tell us that these activities are good. We forget. We get this amnesia that there's these very deeply human practices are already in place. We don't do it alone. We only do it in connection with each other.
So what I'm hearing here is a community, tribal connection, a communing of people. yeah, everything that COVID has really taken us apart. And then we have these racialized traumas that are occurring. And so, you know, as we wrap up this conversation tonight, and I believe it will be continued to help the people to be continue to be resilient. Future, what is one or two takeaways that you will take away and give the people tonight to hang on for a while?
Well, here's what I think. I'm not going to sit here and say that COVID isn't awful, right? Because I've known people that unfortunately have passed away. I know people who have gotten COVID. I know people who have lost their jobs, right? Everything that people would say is an unfortunate part of COVID, I understand. But what I also understand is as humans, we have to look at the positives. We have to look at the positives, and the bowl or the glass is half full. And for me to sit here with both you and Aaron tonight, I'm blessed because I'm here. That's what a lot of people can't say. I'm blessed because I have a job. I'm blessed because I have this opportunity. I'm blessed because I know I have food to put in my mouth and a bed to sleep in and warmth that will help me through the night. You can always look at what you could be grateful and appreciative for, whether that is my friend who listened to me when I needed to cry, or my work with understanding that I have two kids running around here and that I might not be able to Zoom call for 6 hours because it's just not possible with two elementary school students. Look at what you could be grateful for. I would challenge people to rewire your brain by writing it down at night. So you go to bed with good, positive thoughts. And I would also tell people random acts of kindness not only feed your soul, but they feed others. So when you give, you receive because you feel great. So I would say those are the two free things that you could implement tomorrow. Call somebody and say, you were inspirational to me, or you made me feel really good on this particular day. It takes nothing, but it makes you feel so good. And that person you're calling or reaching out to feel amazing. And that happiness will live forever. And it's a memory they could always go back to.
Such powerful words.
Love.
Such powerful words, Future. Thank you so much. Aaron, what would be the last takeaway for this two-part series that you would want to leave with people?
Just like Future said, I don't want to minimize the fact that so many people are hurting right now. We had two dear friends in our family who both lost their parents to COVID. And it's my hope that maybe collectively, as we grapple with the pandemic, as we grapple with the legacy of racialized trauma and structural oppression, that maybe we'll see how much we need each other. I was listening this morning to a talk show from an evolutionary biologist who said that the old theory used to be survival of the fittest. The strongest, the fastest, the smartest, the best tooth and claw is what's going to evolve. Well, the more recent research says that it's actually across species that evolved, it seemed to be survival of the friendliest. Species that learned how to cooperate, species that showed empathy, altruism, and care. Were ones that were more likely to pass their genes on. In this time together, I just want to thank you for this. Has been uplifting for me. Future, you nailed it with this thing. Little tiny acts of kindness, even to people you don't know, reminds me of a mental exercise where you take a minute, you could close your eyes halfway and remember your benefactors, all of the people who brought you to this place where you are. And they just come rushing in when you can think of your benefactors, the people who brought you to where you are, and imagining sending love out to those people, them sending it back to you. I'll keep this conversation with me. Thank you.
Awesome, Aaron and Future. Oh my God, this time has been so special, even with the kids, you know. You didn't tell me to self-regulate. They became a I love it. I love it. And so, you know, thank you for taking the time to be here and to do this two-part series. It's so critical that we have these conversations looking just like we look. And, you know, I would encourage you, as you all have time, that we continue to serve. This is our way. I see this as our random act of kindness. Excuse me. We don't know who's going to hear this message. We don't know what part will connect with people who are out there struggling or, you know, trying to survive. But the fact that we did this, we gave of ourselves and we served somebody. I trust God that somebody's life will be touched and will be transformed. And you know what? I hope that they will come back and you will come back so that we can continue to inspire and make a difference in the world with the platforms that we do have. And again, I want to thank you for your time and your willingness to share with others. And you've been with Tina Boyle-White, the host of the Bridge Broadcast Show. And I've been with the experts, Aaron Heffernan and Future Kane. Thank you so much for being with us. Have a great evening. Bye.
You too, Tina. Bye, guys.